Hey, Edith Head once famously said, "You can be anything you want to be in life, as long as you dress for it." And with the fashion industry reaching a global value of over $3 trillion, it seems few people could disagree. Today on LokadTV, we're going to investigate the supply chain challenges that affect this industry and understand why taking a quantitative approach means you can be a step ahead in what is a very complex marketplace. So Johannes, I guess a good way to sort of understand this industry is looking at how it sort of currently operates. So what is the traditional approach that these fashion industries are sort of taking to the market?
The traditional approach is pretty much geared around the notion of collections. So you have, let's say, 4 collections a year, and your entire process, both from, I would say, merchandising, purchasing, and supply chain, everything, is a gigantic waterfall where you start by composing your assortment, you figure out the quantities, you produce those quantities, you have them transported, and you distribute, and then you repeat the process with the next collection, with having sale to basically liquidate whatever remains of the inventory, so that you have like a clean plate to start over the very same process.
So to sort of illustrate the problem a little bit more, I know it will vary from product to product and from the different brands, but what does a standard sort of product life cycle look like for a fashion product?
So start life cycle is that you will start with the assortment where you compose your collection. So here the challenge is that every collection is like new, so it's new products that we are talking about, at least for a sizable percentage of the products. Some products might be repeated from one collection to another, but it's not supposed to happen for 20 years in a row. Or it's not exactly fashion if it does. So you start with the assortment. Then that means that you need to balance things so that you don't end up with too many products for a segment of the market that is too small compared to what you can capture in terms of demand. Then you need to figure out the quantities that you will order from your suppliers that are typically in relatively, I would say, in distant countries frequently. I mean, if we're speaking of supplying the European market or North American markets, it's typically produced in Asia, East Europe, or South America. So you will have to, well ahead of time, compared to the date where your collection starts, to pass purchase order to your suppliers, who will start to manufacture your good, and so you will need to retro plan all the timing it takes for your suppliers to produce the things so that they will arrive on time to you. And the big challenge is that at the assortment level, you can think product by product, but as soon as you enter, I would say, the phase where you have to pass orders to your suppliers, you have tons of nonlinear constraints, such as, for example, minimal order quantities. A supplier might say that you can only pass an order if you have at least 300,000 meters of fabric per color that you order. So that's kind of a nonlinear constraint that will impact many products at once. Then things get shipped to you, so that's next stage once they have produced, and then you have another set of nonlinear constraints, such as, for example, containers have a maximum number of cubic meters, so you need to optimize your shipments to make the most of the containers. You can also decide to put some products on an aircraft instead of shipping them by the sea. It's more costly, but it typically makes sense to have a small mix that is shipped through aircraft. The idea is that if you want to put in an aircraft through air shipments things that are more urgent to receive, and then things will land in your warehouse, in your warehouses, and then you will start to think about the dispatch to your various channels. So depending on the situation, let's consider a case where the brand has stores of their own. It means that in this new wave of products associated to a collection, you need to take decisions on how many units to be shipped in every store. And here you have, again, a whole truckload of non-linearities, which are if you send too many units at a point of time in a store, the staff of the store is overwhelmed and the store is a complete mess for a week till they unpack everything. So you cannot send too much at a time. But on the other hand, if you don't send enough, an assortment that is not really making sense, the staff cannot, make a good display of the next collection. So you have to balance many things in there. And then you want to keep just enough in your central warehouses, so that as the collection starts, you can replenish dynamically, your stores or your different channels. And if you don't do that, I would say carefully, what you end up with is if, for example, you push too much inventory right to the stores, you end up with stores that run out of stock, while others are having actually excess stocks for the same products. And unfortunately, in fashion, unless you're selling very expensive products, if you're like in selling like affordable fashion, it's typically too expensive to redispatch inventory store to store. So you're kind of stuck. And that's, I would say, probably the end of the life cycle, which is you got the sale that are there to basically liquidate all the excess inventory and basically close the collection per se, so that making room for the next one.
And another trend the market's kind of seeing at the minute is this kind of ultra-fast fashion, where we're sort of seeing lead times as little as a week between design to getting it onto the shelf. So how can we possibly manage to get these lead times so short, and what are the key challenges that we're seeing in order to make that happen?
If you want to really go for fast fashion, you need to compress all those delays. So that entails, I would say, a series of changes, and where I believe quantitative supply chain can help quite a lot. First, you can compress all the delays that are only the result of the fact that it takes time to just take the decisions. So if you want to make a decision on the optimization of your purchase order quantity, does it take a couple of weeks to your purchasing teams to come up with good numbers once the assortment has been finalized, or do you have a software-driven process that can directly produce the same day all those quantities out of any given assortment, just because it performs all the necessary statistical analysis, crunch the historical data, and generate the revised, optimized purchasing decision based on the latest iteration of your assortment. And the same thing can be done for all those small decisions. So interestingly, what I observed is that actually out of those long lead times that are actually preventing companies to move toward this fast fashion, there is a lot of delays that are purely, I would say, the delay imposed by the process that takes time to take decisions. Right? It takes time because it's a lot of people involved and a lot of manual steps in the process. So it's here, there is, I would say, a large opportunity for, I would say, for automations, smart automations. Then if you have a process that can do, I would say, advanced optimization, you can also leverage this very process to also compress your lead times. For example, if you have the opportunity to produce, let's say, in East Europe rather than Asia, but East Europe or Turkey is a bit more expensive. Assuming you want to supply, Western Europe. Then you need to have some logic that tells you when it's actually worth paying more for a production that will happen within a shorter amount of time. So again, if you want to compress your lead times, having like complete end-to-end automation, the calculation is a starting point to start really compressing the lead times. But then once you have that, you can start plugging options in your supply chain that compress those lead times further, such as dynamically choosing your source, potentially opting for a source that is more expensive, but that will give you the product within a short amount of time. And the same thing can be said also about transport, so that whenever you have something that can be transported by sea, there is a more expensive option of transporting it by aircraft. And again, it boils down, it's more expensive, it boils down to have a logic that can do the arbitrage between the two.
Okay, and you mentioned the word there, automation. Let's sort of talk things about from a production perspective now. Uniqlo recently announced they're using automation in one of their warehouses. What are the real sort of production challenges that you really see in this industry, and how can you see sort of automation changing that?
It's interesting because I would say fashion and textile to some extent have been an industry that has been that was at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That was one of the first industries that was, really impacted by mechanical production. So it's interesting. They were there at the very, very, very start. But what happens is that although manufacturing fabric, can be heavily automatized, fashion itself, especially when it comes to cutting, sewing, and everything, is harder to have, I would say, a high degree of automation. So this industry, to some extent, I would say, remain relatively manual, especially if you compare to, let's say, car manufacturing, where the plants are literally gigantic machines with very, very little human intervention. Nonetheless, automation has been progressing, and when it comes to, I would say, logistics, warehouse automation has been progressing rather dramatically. For example, in France, a couple of, I think 2 years ago, La Redoute, which is like a century-old fashion company, announced that their new warehouse was having 20 times the productivity of the old one when it comes to shipments. So there is, I would say, a steady productivity improvement. And what is interesting is that we are now reaching a point where you end up having proportionally a lot of people that are actually clerks who just have to come up with all those numerical decisions to drive all the production units and all the warehouses and to keep the whole thing flowing. But because, I mean, the physical process is getting better and better and more automated every day, it means that the ratio of people that are, those clerks who have to decide all those quantities proportionally are becoming, I would say, dominant. And also dominant not only in terms of headcount, but also dominant in terms of delays. And that's the next challenges will be to basically bring the automation also to the decision-making process. I'm not talking, I would say, of the very high-level strategic decision-making process, such as having a vision for your brands. That will remain, completely the sort of task that is completely dedicated to humans. But I'm talking of taking, micro decisions on tens of thousands of SKUs on a daily basis.
Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about production, we've spoken about warehousing, we've spoken about the transportation. I guess like the final piece of the jigsaw is really the end user and the actual sales process. A big part of the fashion industry is the sales, it's promotions. So that price elasticity, how does that kind of affect things?
So price elasticity is the main mechanism by which fashion brands are liquidating their inventory at the end of the collection by doing sale, so increasing demand and thus liquidating inventory. Now, it's interesting because you can also leverage the same mechanism, but just the other way around, which means if you are heading for stock out, there is no point into rushing into the stock out. So you can raise your price a bit and still reach, unfortunately, a stock out down the road, but you will have done a better overall margin through those products. So price elasticity is an interesting mechanism. It's also a very challenging mechanism because the problem is that if you do a massive sale at the end of every collection, your customers are getting used to that. So they will postpone their purchase decision to the final moment because they expect their sale to happen. So that's very tricky. And again, your intuition can be misleading, and that's also another area where a quantitative, I would say, a quantitative supply chain optimization makes sense. First, because you have to ask yourself the question, for every single product that I sell on every single of my channel. So if you have many stores, every store is a channel of its own. Should I move the price of this product up or down? And you can ask yourself this very question every single day. And by the way, the answer might not be that you have to move all your prices every single day. The answer might be just most of the time, just keep it as it is. But it's another area where obviously if you want to do this process manually, it requires a massive workforce. And that's really a good candidate for, again, quantitative methods that are completely automated.
Okay, so is what you're sort of saying there that instead of sticking to collections, you want to move towards a more sort of gradual phasing between each of the different seasons?
Yes. Also, again, the problem of this waterfall, process is that it creates stress on your supply chain at many levels. I mean, it means that your suppliers are getting massive orders, at certain point of time during the year, and they will have hard time to keep up. Especially if all their other clients are also, doing that. It means that your warehouses will have to process very large intakes at specific time of the year, so it's very difficult for the warehouses. Then you will ship large quantities at specific point of the time of the year, which will be tough for the stores to handle, so that they unpack everything and they put everything on the shelves. And then when you do sale, well, I guess everybody knows what stores look like during a sales period. It's just pure craziness. And I mean, it's kind of good, but also it's a lot of stress for the staff, and for the brand, it also means that you sell a lot of things, but at a sharp discount. So the net result is not necessarily that good. So and compare that to a situation where you're kind of trying to stick to the latest trends all the time, where you have drops of novelty like every single week, where you have things that are flushed out of your assortment every single week, where you have like small shipments all the time. It's much easier to have a good supply chain executing, I would say, a steady flow, instead of having like massive spikes but that are only intermittent.
Okay. One of the big problems with forecasting for the fashion industry is you can't really account for that day when a celebrity walks out the door and he's wearing a specific brand of t-shirt and suddenly sales for that goes mad. So can you ever really account for those sort of like freak spikes in demand, and how can you actually respond to that?
So, I mean, freak spikes is like complete statistical outliers, and so pretty much by definition of what an outlier is, I mean, you can't really forecast that. And so, but the good news is your competitors cannot either. Nobody can, unless you're the celebrity itself that is actually provoking the thing. But unless to have like, private informations, I mean, long story short, you cannot. So there is no regret in having, to have when a celebrity just do something with a new bag, and you had only 5,000 units in stock and they are gone in 2 days, and while normally it should have lasted the entire season. It happened, it's good, at least those are sold, but it would not have made any sense prior to the collection to have tried to order 50,000 bags for this specific type of bags. I mean, it would have been insane. The risks would have been insane. So there is no regrets in having. So what you can do is that if you transition toward probabilistic forecasting, then you can edge your bet. You can start taking into account the likelihood that this sort of things can happen. And by the way, sometimes in fashion, you can have some things can be predicted. For example, if you're into sporting goods, you do not know, and let's say you are selling T-shirts that can be printed with the logos of the various teams, well, every year one team is going to win the national championship. So, it's possible, some brands are doing that you will keep T-shirts where you have the colors but you have not printed the logo, and you will print the logo at the last minute, so that you have like spare T-shirts to be able to print more for the team that will ultimately win, knowing that every year one team ends up winning. That part is highly predictable, even if you do not know which one.
Okay.
So the idea is that you have to transition from a mindset where you will know the future to a mindset where you know the shape of the uncertainty, and you can adjust your decisions taking into account the risk and the financial consequences of those risks.
So what about channels such as Instagram, where you see sort of somebody wearing a particular item of clothing? Would you say that the fashion companies have already pre-thought that through and they'll already have all the stock sort of stockpiled ready to go with that?
I'm pretty sure they don't. I mean, yes, in a science fiction scenario, the brand would approach an artist and know the probabilities that the artist is going to wear the stuff that is being offered, and have, based on those odds, prepared the goods so that they are ready to ship to their clients when the demand will emerge, and all of that coordinated real time. I believe it's complete science fiction. Clearly, there are many brands who are, doing like a guerrilla marketing, trying to approach artists and celebrities, and doing, as a way to market themselves quite successfully sometimes. But my own experience is that in fashion, for most companies, even having a clear picture on how much inventories they have at any point of time, it's a challenge. I mean, yes, there is a system where you know how many units there is in a store, but that doesn't give you the whole picture. What about the returns that you expect? What about the deliveries that you can expect from your suppliers? What about many things that are in transit within your own network, etc. So, for example, just having a clear real-time perspective on just your stock levels is, I would say, already kind of ahead of most fashion brands, I would say, nowadays. So the idea of having a system that is completely holistic, that can take into account the interaction with every single celebrity in every single country, etc. I would say probably right now, complete science fiction. They need to figure out tons of things. There are tons of things that are much simpler that can improve the situation. You don't need to delve into social media, I mean, unless you're already, I would say, rock stars in quantitative analytics.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to have to wrap things up there, but hopefully someone will send us a few shirts or something now we've done an episode on fashion. So that's everything for today. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching.